Hi folks, today I'm going to tell you all about Blitzkrieg 3, a World War II themed real-time strategy game, and in this video I'm going to show you a few things that will help you make up your mind as to whether this game is going to be right for you or whether you should save your money for something better. Now, I'm a fan of history and war games, and I've been playing real-time strategy games ever since Dune 2 and Command & Conquer back in the 90s, so when I got offered a copy of this for review, I was pretty excited to say the least. But has the promise of that excitement been fulfilled? Is this a fantastic game that I absolutely love playing? Well, maybe not so much, but let me tell you all about it, and I'll explain why. Now, Blitzkrieg 3 is based around World War II, obviously. Two aspects to the game, the single player and multiplayer, and they're not completely separated either. The game allows you to choose one of three factions, the Germans, the Russians, or the Americans, which is a little odd, we'll come back to that later, and you play throughout the course of World War II. The game throws missions at you that you have to complete in both early, mid and late war, and completing those missions allows you to unlock new units to equip in your army for future missions, and of course allows you to use those units in player versus player skirmishes as well. You also have your own base that you can develop and deploy units to defend when other players choose to attack it. That's if you want to go in for PvP, of course. So let's take a quick look at the three factions. The Russians, if you choose to play them, you begin in a scenario that has you defending the motherland against German aggression. Alright, that fits in quite well. The Germans, which are the faction I've played the most, have an interesting first scenario, actually. You play a squad of soldiers, German soldiers, that are actually dressed up as Polish troops and have to attack and take over a German radio station. This is actually based on a real-life event that the Germans staged to give themselves a reason to declare war on Poland. It does feel a little bit odd shooting men of your own side, though, but hey, it's part of the story. And the American faction, if you choose to play them, well, they actually start in 1940. Now, I'm a little bit rusty on my history, but I'm pretty sure that the Americans weren't involved in World War II in North Africa in 1940. So when you play them, what you actually get are the British in North Africa in 1940. And yet, they've got an American accents, and you choose an American flag to play under. But they are British soldiers with British equipment and British uniforms. Yeah, go figure that one out. Something seems a little bit messed up there. I think that it's supposed to represent the Allies in general, but it would have been nice to have actually paid a bit more homage to the general makeup of the Allied nations rather than just lump it under an American flag. Now, when you start the campaign, you may only have one scenario that you can go to. You go through and play that, and that unlocks other ones, and then you can choose with some limits on the order that you play through the rest of them, trying to build up the units that you can use in your force and deploy in later battles. This just unlocks units for you to purchase in later games, and you have a little stockpile of each one that you can use so many times when you build a force to go into each new scenario. Now then, word of warning, these scenarios are very heavily scripted. You have to play through them in a set order. You have a set of instructions to do when you're playing the scenario, and if you fail it, you go through it again, and everything happens in exactly the same way as it did before. In my opinion, this gets stale pretty quick if you have to replay the same scenario a few times. On the other side, you do learn exactly what's going to happen, so you should know what to expect. But if you play all the way through and then get hit by something that you didn't quite see coming in the end of the last time you failed, have to play all the way through it again, that gets old very fast, I have to say. There are also some very quirky things that happen in these scenarios. For example, I was playing as, well, let's call them the Allies, because despite the American flag and uniform in the picture, it was the British soldiers in North Africa. And you were fighting the Italians in 1940. Part of a historical campaign. Very good. I like to see history in games. However, at the end of the first few scenarios, you round up all the Italian prisoners in a circle, and as the narrator comes on with an American accent for the commanding officer in your force, he asks you if you want to release the prisoners or mow them all down with machine guns. Now, that seems a little bit odd, and as far as I can tell, it has no bearing on what happens in the rest of the campaign, but even so, why is that really in there? I mean, it doesn't seem to add anything or affect anything. A little bit strange if you ask me, it doesn't feel quite right. Other quirky things that go on in these scenarios, there's one playing through as the Germans, where you're fighting in North Africa, and the British soldiers, there's a load of saboteurs who've infiltrated the native Bedouin towns and villages, and you need to root them out and find them. So you're driving through these villages in your half-tracks and panzers, and, oh, hang on, I can see several squads of British soldiers in that village. There they are, standing around in British helmets, British uniforms, and carrying British Bren guns, yet they're classed as neutrals. And when you click on them, your officer says, nope, those are just Bedouin villages, they're innocent, let's move on. And yet later in the scenario, they turn around and shoot you. And it is so obvious. If they're supposed to be villagers, game designers, please model them correctly or have them hidden, or at least disguise the fact. Having them stand around in British Army uniforms as your soldiers march past and they're unattackable just seems pretty lazy programming, I have to say. But these are just quirky things that I found in the scenarios I've played so far. Now, when it comes to winning these missions, you've got choice of various units. There's various infantry units, just general infantry squads, specialist anti-tank units, which for some of the nations just involve running up close to the tank and chucking a grenade at it repeatedly whilst it machine guns you in the face. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how that's supposed to work. And various reconnaissance and armoured vehicles, which you unlock more of as you go through the game. And of course, in the later war periods, there's new vehicles that come into play. I have found through my experience that it is almost always beneficial just to take all armoured vehicles if you can afford it, because the infantry dies far too fast. And also, it's very limited. If you come up against a tank and you don't have specialist anti-tank units, it does seem like in some cases there's very little you can do, whereas armoured vehicles are pretty much effective against anything else. This, by the way, is especially true in player versus player. If you go into a skirmish and you take all armoured vehicles and the enemy takes a huge chunk of infantry, well, you're going to have quite an easy time against him, it has to be said. That's not to say that infantry aren't useful. They can occupy buildings, which can make them harder to dig out. They can dig trenches, which is interesting, and some units can actually find ways through minefields and disarm things like that. Not that I've actually seen any in the scenarios I've played so far. Moving your troops around the maps is pretty simple. It's just select a unit and right-click where you want it to go or where you want it to attack, and you can move groups of units by highlighting and dragging the area around, all the units on the screen that you want. You can assign them to groups with the controls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 keys, etc., like in lots of other games, and then just right-click and the whole group moves off. The problem with having mixed groups, say some infantry and some vehicles in that group, is then you lose access to the special orders for those particular units. Like infantry, you can order to lie down or dig in. No, you can't, not if they are selected in a group with a vehicle, which suddenly makes trying to select your anti-tank infantry, given the option to go and throw an anti-tank grenade at something, a pain in the backside. If you've got them grouped up, you need to ungroup them so they're not in a group with vehicles, etc., that don't have that order, and then you can order them, by which time you've probably been mowed down and killed. So I found that rather clunky. Now, unlike some games of this genre, you don't actually build up resource points per se by holding areas. You actually build up reserve points. Now, these reserve points are used in the start of the battle to build your initial force to go into the fight with. And throughout the scenarios and missions, then there's certain objectives which will give you more reserve points, and you can bring more troops on from your starting location, that they are effectively reserves, and you can bring them up to help fight at the front line. You can also use these reserve points to buy special support features, such as airstrikes, artillery strikes, anti-aircraft or fighter aircraft to come and chase off the enemy's air power if they're bombing you. These things can be quite useful in the right situations, but they're not always as good as bringing in extra units. Of course, if you end up reserve points but you don't have any extra units to bring in, well, this is a clear outlet for those points to be spent to give you more of a chance in battle. And they do actually work quite intelligently. Like if you call for a squad of paratroopers to be dropped in and you target them on an area to land that is occupied by the enemy, they're probably all going to get shot out of the sky as they drift down. So you do have to think a little bit about things like that. So playing against the AI, what is the AI like? Well, they always seem to have a longer view range than me, so they can shoot me when I can't see them. Now, the AI tactics in this game are pretty basic, and once you work out how to fight them, then you're pretty much golden. they will charge you down with their infantry if you approach them in tanks. They'll just come at you in a wave, at which point you just order your armor vehicles to reverse. The enemies still run at you because they can't get into grenade range whilst you shoot them with machine guns and mow them all down. Yeah, it seems pretty poor after a while. Also, it just doesn't seem right, infantry squads charging up to point blank range and standing in front of a tank repeatedly throwing grenades at it till it's dead. It just loses any sort of immersion or feel, and I don't particularly like that, I have to say. Which leads me into the player versus player side of things. How does this work? Well, when you first get access to it, you can do a 1 versus 1 skirmish, where there are 3 resource points on a map, and basically you fight for control of them, and as you control one, you gain points from that resource node, and when your score in total reaches 1,000, you win. So clearly it's more important to gain control out 2 out of the 3 points before your opponent does. It gives you a head start, and then you can go on the defensive whilst he has to try and wrestle those points off you. Otherwise you're going to win. Now, once again, I've found that just bringing all armoured vehicles seems to work the best for this, and the infantry just dies far too fast. Also, as soon as you start the battle, just send your reconnaissance units out there, the fastest armoured vehicles you've got, as fast as possible to grab control points, and if you get them before your opponent, well, they're going to be on the back foot. And you know what? It just doesn't feel particularly engaging, I have to say. These also lead into 2 versus 2 and 3 versus 3 skirmish games, so they are just player versus player on a bigger scale as you progress through the war and unlock those modes. But I have to say that I've had no trouble finding opponents in the few games I've played. It's all automatic, the system finds an opponent for you, and that's gone ahead being pretty quick. I haven't had to queue, so that's quite good. Now, all in all, I have to say Blitzkrieg 3, it just hasn't floated my boat, unfortunately. It hasn't lit any fires and no sparks of excitement. And to be honest, with the way the missions and scenarios are played out, where they are so repetitive and so scripted that you have to go through each scenario in this order, walking from point A to B to C to D on the map, unlocking things, and I haven't enjoyed that at all. If you have to play through it a couple of times because you didn't get it right in the first or second go, then you will be bored of it by the time you come to the third. Also, some of the weird quirkiness about these things, like why did we have American commanders when they are British troops in 1940? That could be done so much better. It just didn't seem right. When I started an American campaign, I thought I'm going to be playing in the Pacific, or maybe in North Africa in 43 when the Americans land in Tunisia. Also, talking about the voice acting, when you play as the Allies, you get the American voice acting. That's absolutely fine. It's in English. I can understand that. When you play as either the Germans or the Russians, that's not in English. Now, that is nice and in character, and if you happen to speak German or Russian, that's pretty cool for you. You're going to enjoy that. But I don't speak either, and so when you're going through the scenarios and missions and the next set of instructions come on, it's in a language I can't understand, and the text scrolls down the left-hand side of the screen pretty quickly, and in all the action is quite easy to miss. So I find that quite distracting, and I have the language mode set to English. Would have been really nice if they'd had some English voice acting put in for those other nations. And if you're not a native English speaker, you're going to find the same problem when you play as the Allies. Also, the player versus player thing, it seemed kind of cool at first, but after a while, well, we've seen this sort of gameplay so many times before and done so much better. Which leads me to the conclusion that I think you guys could do so much better than buying this game. For example, Company of Heroes 2, you will find on Steam, especially in the sale, for such a bargain price, and I think you'll get far more enjoyment out of that, especially in multiplayer if you can still find people to play with. That is a game that feels like a World War II game, and I feel like it's done a whole lot better. This just feels like a generic real-time strategy game with a World War II theme thrown on top. So for the price that they're asking, which I think is just under £25 British on Steam at the time of making this video, and no, I'm afraid I don't think the game is worth that at all. I think it could be done better. I think it could be made much more interesting. And overall, I think there's been better games that are better designed and better executed in the past that now cost a whole lot less money. So there you go, folks, Blitzkrieg 3. It's not awful, does at least look alright, but gameplay-wise, it's pretty stale, I have to say, and you can do a whole lot better for your money. So anyway, thanks for watching the video. I do hope that it's helped you make up your mind about whether you want to invest in this game or not. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can check out my future game reviews, saving you time and money. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.